Before we start, a quick warning. The story I'm about to tell you is complicated. It's emotional, and it doesn't have easy answers. I'll try to show you different perspectives. The Zionist, the Arab, the British. Not because I want to take sides, but because you can only understand this story if you look at all sides. So, buckle up. Grab yourself a nice cup of tea. This one is going to be a wild ride. Okay, let's start at the beginning. Not the beginning. We will cover that in other videos, but the beginning of the 19th century. Picture this. It's the year 1800. The French Revolution has just ended. Napoleon's armies are sweeping across Europe, and somewhere in a small village in Poland or Lithuania, a Jewish family sits down for dinner. They're speaking Yiddish, a language with German roots, but sprinkled with Hebrew and Slavic words. Here's the thing. At that time, about 75 to 85% of all Jews in the world live in Eastern Europe, mainly in the Russian Empire and Poland. And they are, well, different. Wait, let me be clear. When I say different, I don't mean that as a judgment. I mean it as a fact. Jewish identity in the 19th century was something fundamentally different from what we think of today as a nation. Today, when we say French, we mean someone with a French passport, maybe speaks French, lives in France, eats croissants. You know the vibe. Religion, optional. But back then, it didn't work that way. Identities were ethno-religious. A Jew wasn't just someone who believed in a god. A Jew belonged to a community, defined by religion, culture, history, and yes, ancestry. And here's where it gets interesting. That definition still exists today. Even in modern Israel, the question who is a Jew is way more complicated than who is French. You can convert to Judaism and become a Jew, but you can also be ethnically Jewish and atheist, or culturally Jewish, but not religious at all. That's the legacy of that old ethno-religious identity. And it makes everything in this story messy. Back to the 19th century. Most Jews in Eastern Europe live in small villages, shtetls. They speak Yiddish among themselves. Hebrew, the language of the sacred texts, is only mastered by scholars. For the average Jew, Hebrew is like Latin to a modern Italian. You know it from church, but for daily life? No thanks. And here's the funny part. Yiddish is a Germanic language. Its grammar is basically German. Why? Because many Jews lived in Germany during the Middle Ages. And when they moved east, driven by persecution or in search of a better life, they took their language with them. This map shows the years Jews were expelled from different European countries. England, late 1200s. France, several times during the 1300s. And then the big one, 1492, Spain. The Spanish Inquisition. Yeah, it was real, not just a Monty Python sketch. After being expelled from Spain and Portugal, where a huge Jewish population had lived, many migrated eastward, to Poland, Lithuania, to the Ottoman Empire, to North Africa. And from there to the Jewish world split into distinct groups. Sephardim, from Spain and Portugal, later around the Mediterranean. Ashkenazim, from Germany and Eastern Europe. Here's a question. What did a Jew in 18th century Lithuania have in common with a Jew in Morocco? Answer, religion. And beyond that, almost nothing. Different languages, different customs, different DNA profiles. After centuries apart, Sephardim and Ashkenazim were genetically and culturally distinct. But they shared one thing, faith. And that mattered. A lot. Because it was the only bond that held them together. Now, we jump to the 18th century. The Enlightenment is sweeping across Europe. Voltaire, Rousseau, Kant, reason, rationalism, human rights. And here enters a name you might know, Baruch Spinoza, a Jewish philosopher from Amsterdam. Spinoza basically said, hold on, if we can think rationally, why should we believe in all those mystical stories from the Talmud? The Jewish community in Amsterdam didn't love that. They excommunicated him. Literally, don't talk to us anymore. You're out. But Spinoza was just the beginning. Because the Enlightenment changed Europe fundamentally, and one of its biggest ripple effects was the so-called Jewish emancipation. This map shows when Jews in different countries gained equal rights. The lighter the color, the earlier it happened. France is almost white. Why? The French Revolution, 1789. The revolutionaries said something revolutionary. We must grant the Jews everything as individuals and nothing as a people. Sounds progressive, right? And it was. The idea was, if you want to be part of French society, no problem. You just have to stop defining yourselves as a separate group. You're no longer the Jews, you're now French citizens of Jewish faith. Big difference. Before, Jews as a separate legal community with their own rules. After, Jews as individual citizens with the same rights and duties as everyone else. This idea spread across Europe, faster in the West, slower in the East. But here's the catch. Emancipation only worked if Jews were willing to assimilate. Assimilation meant learning French, dressing French, getting a French education, behaving like a Frenchman. In short, being less Jewish, more French. And many did. They went to French schools, studied at French universities, became doctors, lawyers, merchants. Some became so French that you could barely tell they were Jewish at all. But, and it's a big but, assimilation had a price. The more you assimilated, the more you lost of your own identity. And that created an identity crisis. Imagine this. Your grandparents speak Yiddish, wear traditional clothing, follow every religious rule. You go to a French school, speak perfect French, read Voltaire and Rousseau. Are you still part of the same community as your grandparents? Tough question, and it became even tougher in the 19th century because at the same time, something else was rising. Nationalism. Time jump, 19th century. Europe is obsessed with nationalism. New nations are forming everywhere. Italy unites, Germany unites. Poles fight for independence. Czechs develop national pride. And what is nationalism? At its core, it's romance. It's the idea. We are one people. We share a history, a language, a culture. We belong together, and we deserve our own state. The Germans look back to their ancient tribes who fought Rome. The French romanticize the Gauls. The Italians dream of Rome's greatness. Everyone digs through history to find their heroes, their origin myth. And here's where it gets interesting for the Jews. If you're an assimilated Jew in France and everyone around you is swooning over their Gallic ancestors, Vercingetorix fighting Caesar and all that, what do you say? My ancestors, the Gauls, that feels weird, because your actual ancestors weren't Gauls. They were Israelites, Judeans, somewhere from the Eastern Mediterranean, and that's where Zionism is born. Here's the thesis, and it's important. Zionism is not an ancient Jewish idea. It's a reaction to 19th century European nationalism. Jews were swept up by the same romantic wave as everyone else. Only when they looked back in history, they didn't see Paris or Berlin. They saw Jerusalem, the Temple, King David, King Solomon. They didn't become nationalists because they felt different. They became nationalists because they had become too European. They took the European idea of nation and applied it to themselves. And that led to a fascinating paradox. The more assimilated Jews became, the more some of them started dreaming of their own Jewish nation. Take Leo Pinsker, a doctor from the Russian Empire. In 1882, he wrote Auto-Emancipation, his thesis. Jews will never be truly accepted in Europe. They need their own homeland. Why 1882? We'll get to that. Or Theodor Herzl, the man most people call the father of Zionism. Herzl was a highly assimilated Austrian journalist, hardly spoke Hebrew. Not very religious, by all measures. A modern European intellectual. And then came the Dreyfus Affair. 1894, France. Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish officer in the French army, is accused of treason, Supposedly, he sold secrets to Germany. The evidence? Ridiculous, forged, absurd, didn't matter. Because public opinion screamed, of course it was the Jew. Who else? Dreyfus was stripped of his rank in front of a crowd. People shouted, "Death to the Jews!" Herzl was there, reporting as a journalist, and he thought, wait. We thought we were part of this society. We thought assimilation worked. But if this can happen in France, the land of the Enlightenment, then maybe assimilation doesn't work at all. Years later, Dreyfus was exonerated. Another officer was the real spy. But the damage was done, and Herzl wrote a book, The Jewish State. His thesis, Jews need their own state. Not someday, when the Messiah comes, but now. A modern, secular state. Here's the funny thing. When Herzl and other early Zionists started imagining a Jewish state, Palestine wasn't their first choice. Sure, it had symbolic meaning, the historical homeland and all that. But practically, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire. It was mostly inhabited by Arabs. It wasn't some empty land waiting to be settled. Well, also they considered other options, serious ones. Uganda, yes, seriously. In 1903, British colonial minister Joseph Chamberlain suggested, how about Uganda? We've got some territory there. You can build your state. Herzl actually brought the proposal to the Zionist Congress. Many liked it. Uganda sounded great. No Ottoman negotiations, British support, arable land, Argentina, specifically Patagonia. Baron de Hirsch, a wealthy Jewish philanthropist, even funded Jewish settlements there. There were Jewish gauchos, Jewish cowboys on the Pampas. No joke, look it up. Jewish gauchos in Argentina, they were real. Madagascar. Even the Nazis later toyed with deporting all Jews there, so the idea existed in several forms. And in the Russian Empire, after the revolution, two projects for Jewish autonomy popped up. The Crimea, plans for a Jewish republic there, and Birobidzhan, the Jewish autonomous oblast in far eastern Russia near China. Yeah, the Soviets thought, Jewish homeland. Sure. How about Siberia? Nothing says promised land quite like the Manchurian border in winter, right? But seriously, all these proposals show one thing. The early Zionists were pragmatic. They wanted a safe place for Jews. The geography was negotiable, until something happened, something that changed everything. March 1881, St. Petersburg. Tsar Alexander II is assassinated by revolutionaries. A bomb explodes. The Tsar dies. And now the absurd part. Who gets blamed for it? The Jews, of course. Why? Well, some of the conspirators were Jewish, so obviously the Jews must be behind it. Logical. It's spring, just before Easter. In Christian tradition, a time when anti-Semitic feelings have historically flared up. All those stories about the crucifixion, and so on. And then the pogroms begin. First in Kiev, then in Odessa, then everywhere in the Pale of Settlement, the region in the Western Russian Empire where Jews were allowed to live. I should be clear here. The pogroms of 1881 to 1882 were not on the scale of what would come later in the 20th century. The death tolls were in the dozens to low hundreds. Compared to the Holocaust, 6 million dead, that seems almost negligible. But at the time, people believed they lived in an enlightened age. They thought Europe had civilized itself, that such medieval outbreaks were a thing of the past. The pogroms showed that wasn't true. And here's the interesting part. The pogroms weren't primarily about killing. They were about looting. Jewish homes were ransacked, shops destroyed, people robbed of their possessions. Why? Economic competition, envy. The old story. The pogroms had two big consequences. First, mass emigration. Over the coming decades, some 2 million Jews would leave the Russian Empire. Most went to the United States. That was the main flow. But about 30,000, and this is the important piece, went to Palestine. This was the first aliyah. Aliyah means ascent, in Hebrew, the ascent to Jerusalem, to the Holy Land. These about 30,000 people were the pioneers. They came with a mixture of idealism and desperation. Many were followers of early Zionist ideas. Others simply fled the violence. And here's the crazy thing. Where did they land? In the Ottoman Empire. This was before World War I. Palestine belonged to the Ottomans. The Ottoman authorities were not thrilled. In 1883, the Sultan issued a decree. Jewish immigrants must renounce Russian citizenship and become Ottoman subjects. Why? To control them, to make sure they didn't become their own political force. Still, for the first time in centuries, there was again a significant Jewish population in Palestine. Previously, it might have been around 5,000 out of 300,000 inhabitants, under 2%. After the first Aliyah, about 8 to 10%. And here, the modern history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict begins. Okay, imagine you're one of those immigrants. You come from a shtetl in Poland or Ukraine. You speak Yiddish. You spent your whole life in a small village, surrounded by other Jews. And now you're here, in Ottoman Palestine. It's hot. The landscape is different. People speak Arabic or Turkish, and you're supposed to, what? Do agriculture? Here's the thing. Most Jews in Eastern Europe were not farmers. They were often forbidden from owning land. They were traders, craftsmen, clerks. Their hands were not used to heavy field work, but Zionist ideology said, to become a nation, we must be like other nations. Nations consist of farmers and workers, so we must become farmers and workers. That wasn't easy. The first Aliyah largely failed economically. People didn't know how to farm in this climate. They lacked capital. Many gave up and went to America or back to Europe. But some stayed. And with financial support from wealthy Jews in Europe, especially Baron Edmund de Rothschild, settlements were built. Rothschild financed orange groves, mandarin farms. He tried to copy the French colonial model from Algeria. Spoiler, it didn't work particularly well. The plantations were not profitable. And here's the catch. Of the roughly 5,000 workers on Rothschild's plantations, only 1,200 were Jewish. The rest? Arabs. Why? Because Arab workers were better. They knew the agriculture. They were used to the climate. They worked for less money. That was a problem for Zionist ideology. The idea was Jewish labor, Jewish self-sufficiency. How could you build a Jewish nation if the economy depended on Arab labor? This question would haunt the Zionist movement for decades. Second Aliyah began around 1904 and lasted until World War I. These immigrants were different. The first Aliyah were refugees. They came because they had to. The second Aliyah were idealists, young people, often middle class, students, intellectuals, people who believed in Zionism. Many of them were socialists. Understand this. Early Zionism was strongly left-wing. Influenced by Marxism, the idea was not just to create a Jewish state, but to create a new kind of society. A just, egalitarian society. And that led to the invention of the kibbutz. The kibbutz, an agricultural commune. Everything shared, land, tools, harvest, no private property. Everyone works according to ability and receives according to need. Sound familiar? Yes. It's basically communism. The first kibbutz was founded in 1909 by a group of young people from, hold on to your hats, Romny, a town in today's Ukraine. These people knew each other. They were friends. They shared ideals, and they said, let's build a completely new way of living. In a kibbutz, there is no men's work or women's work. Everyone does everything, 8-hour shifts, then rotate. Children are often raised collectively, not in isolated nuclear families. It's radically egalitarian, and, importantly, it worked. Kibbutzim became economically successful, not immediately, but over time. They were self-sufficient. They produced their own food, and they became the symbol of the new Jewish person. The old Jew, in Zionist narrative, was a ghetto dweller, pale, stooped, buried in books. The new Jew would be a farmer, strong, suntanned, hands in the soil. But here's a problem. Where do you get the land? You buy it from Arab landowners. And it gets complicated. Many of those landowners didn't even live in Palestine. They were absentee feudal landlords living in Beirut or Damascus who owned land in Palestine. They liked to sell. They got good money. But on that land often lived Arab tenants, fellahin, peasant farmers. When the land was sold, they had to leave. Imagine you're an Arab farmer. Your grandfather farmed this land. Your father did too. Now someone says, sorry, the land has been sold. You must leave to whom sold? To these new Jewish settlers. What will they do? They'll build a kibbutz. But don't worry. They'll do the work themselves. They won't need you. How would you feel? Exactly. Not good. And here the conflict between ordinary people begins. Not as an abstract political idea, but as a concrete lived reality. The Third Aliyah came after World War I in the 1920s. These were not idealists. These were people fleeing real catastrophes. In Poland, the new government pushed Jews out of the economy. In the former Soviet Union, during the Civil War, pogroms occurred that made those of 1881 look like child's play. Tens of thousands were killed. People fled. Many came to Palestine. The Jewish population grew. 1922, 83,000. 1931, 174,000. 1936, 384,000. 1939, nearly 500,000. In less than 20 years, the Jewish population sextupled. The Arab population also grew, but not as fast. Suddenly, Jews were no longer a tiny, negligible minority. They became a significant population, and that changed everything. World War I. The Ottoman Empire fights with the Central Powers and loses. 1916, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Britain and France sit down and draw lines on a map, literally, with rulers. So, you take Syria and Lebanon. Okay, you take Iraq and Palestine. Deal. The Arabs who had lived there for centuries were not asked. Why would they? That would have been complicated. But here's the catch. The Brits didn't only negotiate with the French. Oh no, the Brits were busy, very busy. They made promises to everyone, simultaneously. Promise number one, to the Arabs. Sharif Hussein of Mecca led the Arab revolt against the Ottomans in 1916. The British, notably T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, supported him. And they promised, after the war, there will be a large Arab kingdom from Syria to Yemen. Promise number two, to the Zionists. November 1917, the Balfour Declaration. A letter from British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild. Let me quote. The wording matters. The government of His Majesty views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Read that again, slowly. A national home, not a state. What is a national home? Nobody knows exactly. Nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. The non-Jewish communities were 90% of the population. They aren't even named. Oh, this is masterful British diplomacy. Write something so vague that both sides can read into it whatever they want. The Zionists read it and thought, they promised us a state. The Arabs read it and thought, a home? That could be some cultural autonomy, no big deal. The Brits thought, mission accomplished. Both sides are happy. What could go wrong? Spoiler, everything. Everything could go wrong, and it did. Promise number three, to the French. The already mentioned Sykes-Picot carve-up that divided the Middle East into British and French spheres. So to summarize, the British promised the same land to three different parties. That's not even double dealing, it's triple dealing. Is there a word for that? When the war ends, the world order must be reorganized. The League of Nations is created, the predecessor to the UN. And here, Article 22 of the mandate system comes in. I have to quote because it's so absurd. Certain communities formerly belonging to the Turkish Empire have reached a stage of development where their existence as independent nations can be provisionally recognized, subject to the rendering of administrative advice and assistance by a mandatory until such time as they are able to stand alone. In other words, these peoples are not yet mature enough to govern themselves. So civilized nations, I read, European colonial powers, must take on the sacred mission of civilization. Call it what it is. Colonialism. Plain and simple. Colonialism with a pretty label. The mandates are allocated. France gets Syria and Lebanon. Britain gets Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine. And here's the funny thing. The territories deemed not yet ready for independence were exactly those the Central Powers had lost. What a coincidence. German colonies in Africa, not ready for independence, must be cared for by Britain and France. Ottoman territories in the Middle East, not ready either, must be guided by the British and French. Funny that all these immature peoples live on lands with strategic value or resources. Okay, the British now control Palestine, and their policy is inconsistent. That's putting it kindly. On one hand, they promise the Zionists something. So they permit Jewish immigration. They watch as more kibbutzim are established. They allow Jews to build institutions, and the Jews take advantage. They build the Jewish Agency, a quasi-government, the Histadrut, the Trade Union Federation, banks and economic institutions, an education system. It's fascinating. The Jews are building a state before there is a state. The institutions are all there. All that's missing is formal independence. On the other hand, the Arabs were promised something too, and they get nervous. Very nervous. Imagine the Arab perspective. The Ottoman Empire wasn't great, but it was familiar. Now the British arrive and bring these European Jews. More and more, year after year. 1922. Jews are 11% of the population. 1936. Jews are 28% of the population. That's in 14 years. That's fast. Too fast for the Arab population to adapt. And there's more. The Jews are organized. They have money, education, contacts in Europe and America. The Palestinian Arabs, they don't. They are mostly peasants. They don't have a national movement comparable to Zionism. They don't have a wealthy diaspora backing them. And here Palestinian national consciousness emerges, not as an ancient fixed identity, but as a reaction to Zionism. Before, people in Palestine did not necessarily think of themselves as Palestinians. They were Arabs, maybe Syrians, because Palestine was traditionally seen as part of Greater Syria. But now, confronted with organized Jewish immigration, they begin to define themselves as a separate group. As Palestinians, the people of this particular land resisting this particular threat. I don't mean that cynically. Nations often form through differentiation, by opposition to something else. The Germans became German because they fought Napoleon. The Italians became Italian because they fought Austria. The Palestinians became Palestinian because they opposed Zionism. 1929, major riots. In Hebron, Arabs massacre 67 Jews. In other towns, there are attacks on Jewish settlements. The British are overwhelmed. They don't have enough troops. They don't understand local politics. They make decisions that anger both sides. 1936 to 1939, the Great Arab Revolt. This is no longer mere disturbances. This is a full-blown guerrilla war. Arabs attack British forces. They attack Jewish settlements. They blow up pipelines, sabotage railways, carry out assassinations. The British respond harshly, very harshly. They impose curfews. They use collective punishments. If a terrorist comes from your village, the whole village is punished. They carry out executions. And the Jews, they arm themselves too. The Haganah, the defense, the official Jewish militia, semi-legal, at times tolerated by the British, at times opposed. The Argun, more radical, led by Menachem, begin. Their philosophy, an eye for an eye. If Arabs kill Jews, we kill Arabs. No restraint. The Lehi, Stern Gang, even more extreme. These folks attacked not only Arabs, but the British as well, in the middle of World War II. While Britain was fighting the Nazis, these Jewish extremists bombed British targets. And here things get truly complicated. Within the Zionist movement, a split emerges. The moderates, Haganah, Jewish Agency, David Ben-Gurion, say we must work with the British. They're not perfect, but they're better than the alternative. We will build our state piece by piece. The radicals, Irgun, Lehi, Jabotinsky, say the British are colonial masters. They will never willingly give us a state. We must drive them out by force. And then World War II arrives. World War II begins, and for the Jews in Palestine, the situation is complicated. On the one hand, the Nazis are the greatest existential threat the Jewish people have ever faced. Of course, they want to fight the Nazis. On the other hand, the British have just issued the 1939 White Paper, which sharply restricts Jewish immigration, 75,000, over the next 5 years. After that, any further immigration would require the consent of the Arab population. In other words, the British tell the Jews, you can't come here anymore. The doors closed the very year the Holocaust begins. Picture it. Across Europe, Jews are persecuted. Their civil rights are stripped away. In Germany, they're forced to wear the yellow star. In Poland, ghettos are established. And soon, very soon, the death camps will begin. And at the same time, the British are closing Palestine. The United States had already introduced quota systems in the 1920s that heavily restricted Jewish immigration. The Jews are trapped in Europe. There are heartbreaking stories from this time. Ships full of Jewish refugees sailing from port to port turned away everywhere. The met St. Louis, over 900 Jewish refugees. They sail to Cuba. Cuba refuses them. They sail to the U.S. The U.S. refuses them. They sail to Canada. Canada refuses them. They're forced to return to Europe. Many of the passengers will later die in the Holocaust. The Struma, an overcrowded refugee ship in Istanbul's harbor. Turkish authorities don't allow them to disembark. British authorities in Palestine don't allow them to proceed. The ship is towed out to sea. It sinks. 768 people die. The Patria, a ship with illegal Jewish immigrants in Haifa harbor. The British plan to deport them to Cyprus. The Haganah decides to sabotage the ship so it can't depart. They miscalculate the explosives. The ship sinks. 267 people die. These aren't abstract numbers. These are people desperately trying to live. And meanwhile, the Holocaust. 6 million Jews are murdered. European Jewry is annihilated. In Poland, from 3.3 million Jews, about 300,000 survive. In Lithuania, from 200,000, about 20,000 survive. In Germany, near total destruction. See the dark red areas, where over 70% of the Jewish population was murdered. Look at it. Almost all of Eastern Europe is dark red. That was the center of Jewish life. Centuries of culture, language, tradition, erased. And here's something you have to understand. The Holocaust fundamentally changed the world's attitude toward Zionism. Before, people could say Jews should just integrate better in their host countries. Anti-Semitism is a solvable problem. After the Holocaust, that argument was dead, as dead as the 6 million. Because the Holocaust didn't happen in some backward country. It happened in Germany, the land of Goethe and Schiller, the land of poets and thinkers. Perhaps the most civilized country in Europe. If assimilation didn't work in Germany, if even German Jews, perfectly integrated, were gassed, then it worked nowhere. And one more thing. Remember how we talked about Yiddish and Hebrew, how those two languages competed? The Holocaust killed Yiddish. Literally. The speakers died. The Yiddish-speaking communities of Eastern Europe, the shtetls, the towns, the villages, were annihilated. Those who survived and came to Palestine spoke Hebrew, or learned it. Hebrew didn't win because it was the better language. It won because 6 million Yiddish speakers were murdered. That is the brutal irony of history. During and after World War II, the Jewish underground organizations grow more radical. The Haganah still cooperates with the British, mostly. They form the Jewish Brigade, fighting on the Allied side. About 30,000 Jewish volunteers from Palestine serve in the British Army. One of them? Moshe Dayan, the man with the eye patch. He loses his eye in 1941 during a special operation in Syria. After the war, he'll become one of Israel's most important military commanders. But the radical groups, Irgun and Lehi, run out of patience. Their logic: the British are not our friends. They're preventing us from saving our people. They have to go, and they begin a campaign of terror. Let's call it by its name: terrorism. These were terrorist attacks on military and civilian targets. People died. 1944. Lehi assassinates Lord Moyne, the British Minister of State for the Middle East, in Cairo. A political murder at the highest level. 1946. The King David Hotel bombing in Jerusalem. The hotel housed the British headquarters. Irgun plants a bomb. 91 people are killed: Britons, Arabs, Jews. Irgun later claims they sent a warning and the British should have evacuated the building. The British deny that. Who's right? We can't say for sure. What we do know: 91 people died. Here's the uncomfortable truth: terrorism sometimes works. Not morally, not ethically, but pragmatically. By 1946, the British were exhausted. They had just won a devastating world war. Their economy lay in ruins. They were deeply in debt. The empire was fraying, and now they had to fight a guerrilla movement in Palestine. Organized, armed, highly motivated. British commanders calculated, to keep Palestine under control, we'd need 100,000 soldiers, permanently. The British government said, no, we can't afford that. Not financially, not politically. So the British did what they did best. They handed the problem to someone else. 1947. They go to the newly founded UN and say, you know what? Palestine is your problem now. Good luck. We're out. The UN forms a commission, UNSCOP, United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. Representatives from various countries, Canada, Australia, Yugoslavia, and so on. Their task: investigate the problem and propose a solution. They travel through Palestine. They meet with Jews, they meet with Arabs, they meet with the British. Interestingly, they meet Jews and Arabs separately. Why? Because tensions are so high they can't be in the same room. They're in the same hotel. The Jewish delegation on one floor, the Arab delegation on another. The UN reps sprint up and down the stairs. So the Jews propose, the Arabs propose. Can't you just meet? No. A great sign for the future. UNSCOP reaches a conclusion. This is impossible. These two groups cannot live together in one state. Therefore, partition. The 1947 UN Partition Plan proposes a Jewish state, 55% of the land, an Arab state, 45% of the land. Jerusalem under international administration. Look at this map. Do you see the problem? The borders are absurd. The Jewish state is chopped into 3 separate pieces. The Arab state as well. They interlock like a bad game of Tetris. Jaffa, a major Arab city, is an enclave inside the Jewish area. Why? Because, who knows? Maybe the cartographers were having fun. The plan gives the Jews the Negev desert. Generous. Here, take the barren desert. Enjoy. But despite all those issues, the Jewish leadership accepts. Ben-Gurion says, it's not perfect, but it's a start. We'll take what we can get. Details can be worked out later. The Arab side rejects it. completely, categorically. Their position: the whole land is ours. You have no right to create a state here. We will not recognize this plan. Here's the question historians have debated ever since. What would have happened if the Arabs had accepted? The Arab state would have had more land than what remained after the 1948 war. The Palestinians would have had a state immediately. 700,000 people would not have become refugees, but they refused. Why? Several reasons. First, from their viewpoint, the plan was unjust. Why should European immigrants get 55% of the land when they were only about a third of the population? Second, they thought they could win. The surrounding Arab states, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, had just become independent or soon would be. They had armies. They might help. Third, compromise was politically impossible. Any Arab leader proposing compromise risked losing his position, or his life. So no compromise, no partition, all or nothing. They got nothing. November 1947, the UN General Assembly votes on the partition plan. 33 in favor, 13 against, 10 abstentions. The plan passes. In Tel Aviv, people dance in the streets. Tears, hugs, jubilation. We're getting a state. After 2,000 years of exile, after the Holocaust, we're getting our state. In the Arab areas, anger, grief, determination to stop this. The next day, the war begins. Officially, the war begins May 15, 1948, when the Arab armies invade, but unofficially, it begins November 30th, 1947, one day after the UN vote. It's a civil war at first, no regular armies yet. Militias, raids, assassinations, massacres. Arab militias attack Jewish settlements, Jewish militias attack Arab villages, atrocities on both sides, and things get precarious for the Jews. Remember, Jewish settlements are scattered across the land. This map shows it, tiny dots everywhere, isolated kibbutzim surrounded by Arab territory. How do you supply these settlements? How do you communicate between them? Convoys, armed convoys carrying food, weapons, ammunition. Arab militias set up ambushes. They fire on the convoys. Some get through, some don't. Imagine you're in an isolated kibbutz. No contact with the outside world for days. Food is running low. Ammunition too. Attacks every day. And then you hear, a convoy is coming. Hope. You wait. Hours. Then gunfire in the distance. The convoy is under attack. Will it break through, or will you have to wait even longer? That was the reality for months. Some kibbutzim fell. In Gush Etzion, south of Jerusalem, 4 settlements were overrun by Arab forces. Many defenders were killed. Some were massacred after surrender. In the Jewish old city of Jerusalem, besieged for months. The residents nearly starve. Finally, in May 1948, the old city falls. The defenders capitulate. The Jordanian Arab Legion takes them prisoner, and then they blow up every synagogue. Not one, not two, all of them. This photo shows the ruins of the Herva synagogue, centuries old, an architectural jewel, demolished. It wasn't militarily necessary, it was symbolic. It said, "You don't belong here." But the Jews don't give up. Not just out of idealism, but because they have no alternative. They even have a phrase, "In Brera, there is no alternative. Either we win or we die." That's not hyperbole. That was the genuine fear, that if they lost, it would be a second Holocaust. So they fight with a desperation that's hard to fathom if you weren't there. And slowly, very slowly, the tide begins to turn. Here's a problem: weapons. The Arab armies have weapons, from the British. Jordan's Arab Legion is literally commanded by British officers. They have artillery, tanks, planes. The Jews, they have not much. At the start of the war, the Haganah has about 10,000 rifles, a few hundred submachine guns, handmade grenades, 2 tanks, almost tanks, 0 airplanes. That's not great. So begins one of the wildest arms procurement operations in history. Buckle up. This is wild. Operation 1. Loot. Europe. Post-war Europe is littered with weapons everywhere. Abandoned depots, sunken ships, forgotten bunkers. The Haganah sends teams across Europe. Mission: find weapons. Buy them, steal them. Somehow move them. Get them to Palestine. They set up hubs in Belgium and France. They buy former German weapons. They borrow British arms from deserted stores. Operation 2. Czechoslovakia. This is the main supplier. During the war, Czech factories produced for the Nazis. Now, under Soviet control, they have warehouses full of weapons and no buyers. The Jews show up, will buy. And the Czechs sell, with Moscow's tacit blessing. What do the Jews buy? MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns, German weapons, Mauser rifles, and, wait for it, Messerschmitt fighter planes. You heard right, Jews flying Messerschmitts. Okay, technically the Avia S-199, Czech-built versions with weaker engines. But the design? Messerschmitt Bf-109. The irony is delicious. Nazi-designed planes, built to kill Jews, now flown by Jews to defend a Jewish state. So absurd it has to be true. Operation 3, Italy. In Italy, the communists prepare for a possible coup. They're stockpiling weapons, lots of weapons. Jewish agents arrive. Ciao, we're also, socialists, comrades, solidarity. Will you sell us arms? Italian communists. Certo. For the revolution. The weapons don't go to an Italian revolution. They go to Palestine. Operation 4. The wildest capers. The Haganah buys 4 British bombers. How? They pretend to be a New Zealand film studio shooting a movie about the Pacific War. Yes, we need 4 airworthy Lancaster bombers for aerial footage. Absolutely, they get the planes. They fly them to Czechoslovakia, from there to Palestine. This is Ocean's 11-level insanity, and it worked. And here's the kicker. Who greenlit all this? Stalin. Yes, Joseph Stalin initially supported Israel. Why? Several reasons. First, many early Zionists were socialists. Stalin thought Israel might become a socialist country, a Soviet-friendly foothold in the Middle East. Second, Israel was a way to needle the British. The USSR wanted Britain out of the region. If the Jews fought the British, all the better. Third, Stalin hated the British and wanted to humiliate them. What's more humiliating than the failure of their mandate? So, Soviet weapons via Czechoslovakia plus Soviet diplomatic backing equals Israel survives. The irony? Within a few years, Israel will be closely aligned with the United States, and the USSR will be the enemy. But in 1948, Stalin helped midwife Israel. Armed with these weapons, the Haganah launches an offensive. Plain Dalet. Dalet, the 4th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The idea, we won't sit and wait anymore. We go on the offensive. We link up our isolated settlements. We secure the territory assigned to us by the UN. And if that means taking Arab villages that stand in the way, then we do that. Here begins one of the most controversial phases of the war. Deir Yassin, an Arab village near Jerusalem. April 9th, 1948, Irgun and Lehi fighters attack. A massacre occurs. Numbers are disputed. Between 100 and 250 Arab civilians killed. What exactly happened? Still debated. Jewish version. It was a military operation. The village was a base for attacks. There was resistance. Civilians died in the fighting. Tragic, but war. Arab version. It was a deliberate massacre. Defenseless civilians murdered, including women and children. The truth? Probably somewhere in between. It was war. Brutal, chaotic war. People die. Not every death is planned, but not every death is accidental either. What we do know, Deir Yassin had a huge effect. The news spread. Panic rippled through Arab villages. People thought, If this can happen in Deir Yassin, it can happen anywhere. And they fled. Jews call 1948 independence the birth of Israel. Arabs call it the Nakba, the catastrophe. Between November 1947 and the end of 1949, roughly 700,000 to 750,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from the area that became Israel. That was about 3/4 of the Arab population in that territory. This is a humanitarian catastrophe. Let's call it what it is. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their homes, their land, their way of life. The question historians debate: why did they flee? The Israeli narrative: Arab leaders urged civilians to leave so their armies could act freely. Go for a few weeks. When we win, you'll return. People left voluntarily, expecting a swift Arab victory. Evidence: some radio broadcasts, some refugee testimonies. The Palestinian narrative: Jews expelled them by force. Plan Dalet was a systematic plan of ethnic cleansing. Massacres like Deir Yassin weren't exceptions, but part of a strategy to spread fear. People fled out of fear of violence, not because their leaders told them to. Evidence: accounts of expulsions, eyewitnesses, military documents, the historical truth. Probably both. In some places, people fled in fear without direct violence. Rumors of massacres spread, panic followed. In other places, they were actively expelled. Israeli units cleared strategically important villages and told residents, "Go." Now, and in yet other cases, there was violence. Not everywhere, not always systematic, but it happened. And here's something to understand. The Jewish leadership was not unified on this. Some, the hardliners, said, "Good that they're leaving. We need a Jewish land. The fewer Arabs, the better." Others, more moderate voices, said, "This is a mistake. We need Arab labor. Our economy will collapse." Ben-Gurion himself was ambivalent. He didn't openly say, "Expel them," but he didn't stop it either. He let it happen. And after it happened, Israel seized the abandoned property, houses, fields, shops, the absentee property law, 1950. If you left the country, no matter why, you lost your property. It now belonged to the state. That's problematic, to put it mildly. Israel's Jewish population grew dramatically, not only through immigration, but because 700,000 Arabs left. Suddenly there were empty houses, empty villages, ownerless land. New Jewish immigrants, many themselves refugees from Arab countries, moved into these houses. Often, they didn't even know whose they had been. But Palestinian refugees, remember, they keep keys to homes that no longer exist. They have deeds to land they're not allowed to enter, and that remains unresolved to this day. The refugees of 1948 and their descendants, now millions, still demand a right of return. Israel says, no, impossible. If millions of Palestinian refugees return, Israel would no longer be a Jewish state. Palestinians say, "You expelled us. You must let us return." Neither side moves. This is the core problem that remains unsolved. May 1948, Tel Aviv, the Tel Aviv Museum. The British are leaving. Their mandate ends at midnight. But the Jews don't wait for midnight. At 4 p.m., before Shabbat begins, David Ben-Gurion proclaims Israel's independence. By virtue of the natural and historic right of the Jewish people and of the resolution of the United Nations General Assembly, we hereby declare the establishment of the Jewish state in the land of Israel. That's the state of Israel. That's it. The document is short. The ceremony lasts 17 minutes. But in those 17 minutes, history is made. For the first time since 135 CE, since the crushing of the Bar Kokhba revolt, a Jewish state exists again. The crowd sings Hatikva, the hope it will become the national anthem. People weep, embrace. Can't believe it's real. Imagine, you're a Holocaust survivor. 3 years ago, you were in Auschwitz. Your entire family is dead. Now you stand here, in a Jewish state. a state that says you belong here, you are safe. This is not abstract, it's real, it's life-changing. But the euphoria doesn't last long. May 1948, midnight. The armies of 5 Arab states invade. Egypt from the south, Transjordan from the east, Syria from the north, Iraq from the east, Lebanon from the north, plus irregulars from Saudi Arabia and Yemen. On paper, it's hopeless. A newborn state, not 24 hours old, against 5 armies. Azam Pasha, Secretary General of the Arab League, declares, "This will be a war of extermination and a momentous massacre, of which history will record the likes of the Mongol massacres and the Crusades." Big words. Unfortunately for the Arab side, it didn't work out that way. Here's the crazy part. On paper, the Arab armies were superior. On paper. In reality, problem 1. No coordination. 5 different armies. 5 command structures. No joint strategy. Poor communication. Egypt and Jordan hated each other. Syria and Iraq didn't trust each other. Everyone wanted their own glory and territory. The Jews had a unified command. 1 army, 1 plan. Problem 2. Feudal armies. Arab armies were monarchs' armies. The king commands. His relatives are officers. Loyalty greater than competence. The Israeli army? A people's army. Everyone served, including women, already in 1948. Promotion based on merit, not birth. Problem 3. Little modern military tradition. In the Ottoman Empire, Arabs traditionally didn't serve much in the army. That was for Turks and others. Military careers weren't prestigious. The Jews? Many had served in the British Army in World War II, fought the Nazis, and knew how modern war worked. Problem 4. Outnumbered? Wait, weren't the Arabs more numerous? Number. Israel actually mobilized more fighters than all the Arab armies combined. Israel mobilized almost its entire population. Men and women, anyone who could hold a weapon. The Arab states sent their standing armies. Relatively small contingents. Egypt, 10,000. Transjordan, 8,000 to 12,000. Syria, 3,000 to 6,000. Iraq, 3,000 to 5,000. Lebanon, approximately 1,000 total at the start, maybe 30,000 to 40,000. Israel, 35,000 at the start. By war's end, 115,000. Yes, by the end, Israel had 3 times as many soldiers as all the Arab armies combined. Changes the story a bit, doesn't it? The fighting. At first, the Arabs had successes. Jordan's Arab Legion, the best Arab force, led by British officers, captured Jerusalem's Old City. The Egyptian army pushed into the Negev, threatening Tel Aviv. The Syrian army attacked from the north Wadi Aava, but was stopped quickly. Then a UN-brokered truce. 4 weeks. Those 4 weeks saved Israel. Why? Both sides used the pause to reorganize and rearm. But Israel used it better. More weapons from Czechoslovakia, more training, more mobilization. When the fighting resumed, Israel was stronger, much stronger. The Israeli army went on the offensive. Operation Dani, capture of Lydda and Ramleh, 2 large Arab cities. The population, 50,000, was expelled. Ben-Gurion gave the order personally. Operation Yoav, breakthrough in the Negev. The Egyptian army was encircled. Only a truce saved it from annihilation. Operation Hiram, the north. Lebanese and Syrian forces pushed back. Galilee fully captured. By the end of 1948, Israel controlled all the territory allotted to it by the UN, plus about half of the territory intended for the Arab state, minus Jerusalem's Old City, and the West Bank, held by Jordan, minus the Gaza Strip, held by Egypt. Israel became larger, much larger. The Arabs had attacked to prevent partition, to get everything. They ended up with less than the UN had originally offered. This will become a pattern. Every time Arab states attack Israel, Israel gets bigger. 1956, Suez Crisis. Israel takes the Sinai, later returns it. 1967, Six-Day War. Israel takes the West Bank, Gaza, Sinai, Golan Heights. 1973, Yom Kippur War. Israel is surprised, recovers, advances further. It's almost comical. Attack Israel, and Israel expands. By early 1949, it's clear. Israel has won. Arab armies are exhausted, demoralized, in places encircled. They can't win. So armistice talks begin. Important, these are armistices, not peace treaties. Arab states refuse to make peace. That would mean recognizing Israel, which is politically impossible. An Arab leader who recognized Israel risked being overthrown or assassinated. King Abdullah of Jordan was assassinated in 1951, partly for being deemed too conciliatory. So, armistices. We're not fighting right now, but we're still at war. The armistice lines, the green line, become Israel's de facto borders, but no Arab state recognizes these borders. No diplomatic ties, no trade, no recognition. Israel exists in a permanent state of siege. And here's the tragedy. This state lasts decades. Egypt makes peace only in 1979, after another war. Jordan in 1994. Syria, no peace treaty to this day. Lebanon, no peace treaty. Iraq, no peace treaty. Most Arab states still do not recognize Israel. Back to 1949. Israel exists. It has survived. Now, it has to build. And here's something remarkable. The infrastructure already exists. Remember decades of Zionist institution building, the Jewish agency, the Istadrut, the school system, the kibbutzim. All that is in place. Israel basically has to raise a flag over it and say, state. It's unprecedented. Usually you fight for independence first and build the state after. Israel built the state first, then fought for independence. Ben-Gurion becomes prime minister. The pragmatist who'd been there from the start, who once backed the Ottoman Empire and pivoted instantly. He faces enormous challenges. Problem 1, refugees, the Jewish ones. Remember, 700,000 Arabs fled from Israel. At the same time, 800,000 Jews fled Arab countries. In Iraq, pogroms, Jews flee. In Egypt, Jews dispossessed, they flee. In Yemen, an entire community airlifted in Operation Magic Carpet. In Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Jews flee or are expelled. Israel absorbs all of them, 1 million people into a country with about 650,000 Jews at the time. The population doubles in a few years. This matters, yes, 700,000 Palestinian refugees, but also 800,000 Jewish refugees from Arab lands. An almost symmetrical population exchange. Jewish refugees were integrated in Israel, not always smoothly, but it happened. Palestinian refugees were largely not integrated. Arab countries kept them in camps. To this day, problem 2, the economy. War is expensive. Israel is broke. Infrastructure damaged. Not enough housing, jobs, not enough of anything. Solution, diaspora aid. Donations from Jews worldwide. Loans, later German reparations. Problem 3, language. Many newcomers don't speak Hebrew. They speak Arabic, Yiddish, Russian, Ladino. Israel launches intensive Hebrew courses, Ulpanim. Everyone must learn Hebrew. Within a generation, Hebrew becomes dominant. Also remarkable, a dead language was revived. People arriving with many mother tongues now all speak Hebrew. It's the only successful language revival in modern history. Problem 4, security. Israel is surrounded by hostile states, long borders, hard to defend. Solution, universal conscription. Everyone serves, men 3 years, women 2. The IDF becomes one of the region's most effective armies. Let's end with the contradictions. Israel's history is full of them. Contradiction 1. Religion versus secularism. Israel was founded by secular Zionists, people like Ben-Gurion who believed in the nation, not in God. But they needed the religious Jews, so they compromised. Result, Israel is officially secular, but Shabbat is the official day of rest. The army keeps kosher. Religious parties wield enormous political influence. There is no civil marriage, only religious. Endless internal conflicts to this day. Contradiction 2. Democracy versus ethnocracy. Israel calls itself a Jewish and democratic state, but can you be both? Democracy. All citizens are equal. Jewish state, a state for Jews. What about the 20% Arab citizens of Israel? They can vote, they have rights, but they sing a national anthem about Jewish hope. They live under Jewish symbols, a national story that excludes their own. Are they truly equal? That question remains unresolved. Contradiction 3. Victim versus occupier. Jews were victims for 2 millennia, persecuted, expelled, murdered. Zionism was the response, a bid for safety. But to achieve that safety, Israel displaced others, made others refugees. Since 1967, it occupies the West Bank. How do you reconcile that? Israelis often say, "We had no choice." It was survival. Palestinians say, "Your survival came at our expense." Both are true, and that's the tragedy. I want to be clear, this story has no easy answers. You can understand the Zionist perspective, a persecuted people desperate for safety. Holocaust survivors saying, "Never again. We need our own state." You can also understand the Palestinian perspective, people who had lived there for generations and were suddenly displaced, who ask, "Why must we pay for Europe's crimes?" The truth is, both peoples have legitimate claims. Both have suffered. Both have caused suffering. The problem is, they have to live on the same small piece of land. We've taken a long journey today, from the 19th century to 1949, from the rise of Zionism to the founding of Israel. What did we learn? Lesson 1. Ideas have power. In 1897, the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine was absurd, ridiculous, impossible. 50 years later, that state existed. An idea carried by enough determined people can become reality, even when the odds are astronomical. Lesson 2. Nationalism is a modern invention. We often think nations are ancient. They aren't. Most modern nations, including Israel, were invented in the 19th and 20th centuries. They rest on selective memories, romanticized stories, and sometimes outright inventions. That doesn't make them less real, but it does make them less sacred. Lesson 3. History is complicated. There are no tidy good versus evil tales. Each side has reasons for its actions. Each side has done wrong. Israel is not simply a settler colonial state, but it is also not simply a state of persecuted victims. Palestinians are not simply terrorists, but some committed acts of terror. The truth is nuanced, always. Lesson 4. Conflicts don't solve themselves. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has lasted over 75 years, multiple wars, thousands, millions of lives affected. Why? Because both sides cling to maximal demands, because compromise is branded betrayal, because each generation passes hatred to the next. The Arabs could have accepted the partition plan in 1947. They'd have had more territory than now. Israel could have returned the West Bank after 1967. It might have had peace. In both cases, each side thought it could have everything and ended up with less than before. There's a Hebrew proverb, "The perfect is the enemy of the good." If you wait for the perfect solution, you often end up with no solution. Zionism understood this. Ben-Gurion said in 1947, "I'll take these borders. They're not perfect, but it's a start." The Arab side said, "We'll take only everything." And lost. Lesson 5. Timing is everything. Israel emerged in a unique historical moment. After the Holocaust, when the world felt sympathy for the Jews, during decolonization, as new states were being born. At the dawn of the Cold War, when both the US and the USSR supported Israel, before the Arab oil embargo, when Arab states had less leverage. 10 years earlier, the Ottomans would have blocked it. 10 years later, the Cold War would be entrenched, the Soviets firmly on the Arab side, Arab states stronger, the oil embargo a weapon. Israel arose in the perfect window, as if history conspired to create that moment. But enough philosophy. Let me end with facts. Where they ended up, David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, served until 1963, with a break, retired to a kibbutz in the desert, died 1973, just before the Yom Kippur War. Menachem, Begin, the Irgun terrorist leader, became prime minister in 1977, signed peace with Egypt in 1978, won the Nobel Peace Prize. Irony, anyone. Moshe Dayan became defense minister, led Israel to victory in 1967, a legend in his lifetime. Golda Meir, the woman who once worked in a burlap sack in the fields, became prime minister in 1969, the fourth woman worldwide to hold such office. Theodor Herzl died 1904, 44 years before Israel was founded, never saw the dream realized. His remains were moved to Jerusalem in 1949 for a state funeral. Eliezer ben Yehuda, the man who revived Hebrew, died 1922, but his language lives. Today, about 9 million speak Hebrew natively, a dead language brought back. Let's review the numbers. 1881, 5,000 Jews in Palestine, under 2% of the population. 1918, 85,000, 10%. 1947, 630,000, 33%. 1949, 1 million, 80%. From tiny minority to dominant majority in 70 years. Transformative, unprecedented. And it didn't happen by accident. It happened through an ideology, Zionism, organization, Jewish agency, Histadrut, etc., capital, donations, investment, timing, the perfect historical moment, determination, people willing to die for this goal. But it also came at the expense of others. 700,000 Palestinian refugees, hundreds of destroyed villages, a population still living in exile. That's the uncomfortable truth. You can admire Zionism's success, and perhaps you should. It's a remarkable story. But you must also acknowledge the price, the people who paid it. You might be asking, what's the moral of this story? Honestly, I'm not sure there is one. History isn't a fable. It doesn't end with a tidy moral. It's chaotic, contradictory, unfair. But if I take anything away, it's this. First, never underestimate the power of people with a vision. Early Zionists were mocked. A Jewish state in Palestine? Ridiculous. And yet, second, mind the perspective. This story looks entirely different depending on whom you ask. For Israelis, 1948 is independence, the fulfillment of a 2,000-year dream, the end of exile. For Palestinians, 1948 is the Nakba, peace catastrophe, the beginning of exile. Both narratives are true, at the same time. Third, compromise isn't weakness, it's wisdom. History shows those who demand everything often end up with nothing. Those who accept less survive. Ben-Gurion understood that. The Arab leadership in 1947 did not. Fourth, the past is not the future. Yes, Israel was born in conflict. Yes, unresolved issues remain. Yes, there is pain on all sides. But that doesn't mean it must stay that way. Israel and Egypt fought 4 wars. Today they have peace. Imperfect, but peace. Israel and Jordan were enemies. Today they cooperate. Maybe one day there will be peace with the Palestinians too. I'm a historian, not a prophet. I don't know what the future holds. But I do know this. If a group of idealistic students from Eastern Europe could build a state in the desert, against all odds, then maybe peace is possible too. It just requires both sides to stop dreaming of maximal solutions and start working on practical ones. I know this video was long, very long. Thank you for sticking with it. This story is complicated. It can't be told in 60 minutes. Anyone who claims there are simple answers, Israel good, Palestinians bad, or Palestinians victims, Israel villains, is oversimplifying. Reality is nuanced. Both sides have reasons. Both made mistakes. Both suffered. My goal wasn't to tell you what to think, but to give you tools to think for yourselves. Facts, perspectives, contradictions. What you do with them is up to you. Israel exists. That's a fact. A country of 9 million people, with a culture, a language, an identity. Palestinians exist too, with their own identity, history, and claims. Both are real. Both are legitimate. The question is not who is right. The question is, how can both live on the same land? That question has gone unanswered for 75 years. Maybe it will never be answered perfectly, but it must be asked again and again until there's an answer both can live with. The story of Zionism and Israel's founding is a story about the power of ideas, the complexity of identity, the costs of nationalism, the possibility of the impossible, and the tragedy when two peoples claim the same land. It's not a tale of heroes and villains, it's a tale of people. Fallible, complex people. The early Zionists were no saints, but not demons either. They were people with a vision who risked everything to realize it. Palestinians were not passive victims, nor irrational aggressors. They were people defending their land as they understood it. And in between, the British, the Americans, the Soviets, the Arab states, each with their own agendas, complicating everything. Final thought. What fascinates me most is this. In the 19th century, almost no one spoke Hebrew. It was a dead language. Today, it's millions' mother tongue. In the 19th century, a Jewish state was fantasy. Today, it's a regional military power. That shows the future isn't preordained. People can shape it with will, organization, and yes, luck. Whether that's good or bad depends on your perspective. But possible? Proven. Last line, Israel's story isn't over. It continues. With new chapters, new conflicts, and hopefully new solutions. What I told today is just the beginning. The story of the founding. What comes after? 1956, 1967, 1973. The Intifadas. The peace processes. The failed negotiations. Those are stories for other videos. But the foundation? We laid it today. From the first spark in the mind of an assimilated Viennese journalist, to the moment Ben-Gurion stood at a microphone and said, "We hereby declare the establishment of the State of Israel 70 years, one lifetime, an impossible journey, and yet, it happened." That's it for today. I hope you learned something, or at least found something to think about. If this video resonated, or even if it didn't, but you still think it matters, leave a like, subscribe, and share it with anyone who loves history. And above all, stay critical. Don't believe anything blindly. Not me, not anyone. Check sources. Read different perspectives, form your own opinion. In the comments, I'm eager to hear your thoughts. But please, be respectful. These topics are emotional, deeply personal for many. We can debate without being demeaning. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and above all, stay human.